We're studying still. I'm hoping today will be the last class where our primary source is the Bible. And starting next week, we can move to the Haggadah. But I've been saying from the beginning of the class that we couldn't have just started in the Haggadah. It's impossible. We have to first have an understanding of where the Haggadah comes from and how the central ideas of the Haggadah develop from the verses in mostly Exodus chapter 12 and the beginning of chapter 13, which introduce the first laws in the Torah. These are the first laws in the Torah. And they happen to be about a holiday that I've also submitted is a holiday that is Judaism. This is Judaism, this holiday. It is the central observance conveying the central values and themes and, of course, the central story of the Jewish people. So, hopefully today we'll wrap up. We're in the book of Exodus, chapter 12. If you have a Eitz Chaim Chumash, maybe someone can call out the page number. It's Exodus chapter 12. Let's start today. I want to just review again, starting from verse 43. So it's page 389 if you have the Eitz Chaim Chumash. And if you're at home, you can use your own Chumash, Exodus 12, verse 43, or you can certainly pull up a Google search for Exodus 12, doesn't matter what translation you're using, and you can follow along with us. Exodus chapter 12, verse 43. This is just after we discussed the question of what it means that Passover was and will be a Leil Shimurim. I told you that the common understanding of Leil Shimurim is, I think someone offered, that it was a night of protection. Lishmor means to watch over, to keep. So, custom developed on Passover that it was a night where God had special protection. The stars were aligned in the favor of the Jewish people because it was a night that annually is destined to commemorate the most important day when God watched over the Jewish people, and that is the original Passover, the plague of the firstborn. Just a reminder, that word Leil, again emphasized, Leil, the night, the watch night. Passover is a night celebration, a night observance. But I offered a secondary meaning that I like more, and that is that Leil Shimurim might mean the night of kept promises. God promised Abraham that after years of slavery in Egypt, his descendants would be redeemed. On the night of Passover, God kept his promise. God told Moses and Aaron a couple weeks before, I'm going to pass over your homes. I'll save you. I'll liberate you. On the night of Passover, God kept his promise. And I said that this perhaps is a connection to Elijah the prophet, who is one of the central characters of Passover. And since he represents the promise of redemption, it's appropriate that he be honored or referenced, at least, in our modern commemoration of Pesach. But I want to return next to the question of inclusivity and exclusivity. Who's in and who's out? Before we return to the text, let's just appreciate that this is we can't take anything for granted. We're reading from the Bible, so erase from your minds the Judaism that you know, and think instead of the Judaism that's being conveyed through the Bible. You knew nothing about Judaism, you were just trying to learn about Judaism through the Bible. This is the first time the Torah talks about who's in and who's out. Who's a part of it and who's not. Inclusivity and exclusivity introduces a major idea that I don't think I gave enough justice to last week. Right? There are many religions out there that don't have such boundaries. If you want to come to church, why would anybody turn you away? But the depiction of the Passover sacrifice, right there in the verse right after Leil Shimurim, verse 43, the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, this is the law of the Passover offering. The first thing that is said about the Passover offering is, Kol ben nechar lo yochal bo. This isn't for everybody, for the world. This isn't for the world. The Passover offering is exclusively for who? Well, there's a bunch of categories that are included in those who may partake of the Passover sacrifice, but certainly there's also a bunch of categories who are excluded. The idea is really important and must be navigated very carefully throughout the remainder of Jewish history. Who's in and who is out? Does this text say, let's read the verses and then I'm going to ask you these questions. 43, okay, Kol ben nechar lo yochal bo, no foreigner shall eat of it. Now let's look at 44. But if you were a slave, you can eat of it once you've been circumcised. No bound or hired laborer shall eat of it. Now let's skip to verse 47. The whole community of Israel shall offer it. Verse 48, if a stranger who dwells with you would offer the Passover to the Lord, all his males must be circumcised. Then he shall be admitted to offer it. He shall then be as a citizen of the country, but no uncircumcised person may eat of it. Verse 49, there shall be one law for the citizen and for the stranger who dwells among you. Okay, so if I'm a Jew, but I'm not circumcised, am I permitted to eat the Passover sacrifice? Yes? No? No. It's very clear. You can't. All the males must be circumcised. And it says there's one law for the citizen and there shall be one law for the stranger and the citizen. The implication here is, even if you are Jewish, I mean, the whole idea of Jewish is still developing within the Bible, but even if you're descended Jewishly, if you're not circumcised, you can't partake of the Passover offering. Can you see that in the text? I just want to make sure you all see that. Even though it says the whole community of Israel shall offer it in verse 47. And there's a way for those who are not in the community of Israel to offer it. What's the way how do they offer it? They're circumcised. If you're Jewish, it says, okay, you have to offer the Passover sacrifice, but there's one law for the stranger and the citizen. I want to say that properly. I don't mean there's one different law for the citizen. Torah achat. There's one law. So if the law says that you must be circumcised if you're a stranger in order to offer the Passover offering, then obviously you must be circumcised if you're a citizen in order to offer the Passover offering. Do you all agree with me? Yeah. Good. I like when people agree with me. So what is the central insider value? What is the central ID card that enables you, vaccine passport, that enables you to offer the Passover offering? It's circumcision. I don't know if they checked. Not mentioned. They don't say anything about the woman. The implication is therefore that women do not offer perhaps the Passover offering. But this gets developed later in rabbinic literature. I want to stick to the Bible. It's a very good question. Where are the women? They were saved too. So, go back to my theme. Passover is Judaism. We have been introduced to so many different ideas and concepts and values in Judaism already, just in 43 verses. And now we're being introduced to one of the central observances of Jewish life still today, and that is circumcision. Now let me ask you something. Let's not take that for granted. Why are we learning about circumcision in the midst of the story of Pesach? Let me ask the question again. What is the relationship? Why does God require circumcision in order to qualify for offering the Passover sacrifice? Think carefully. What is the relationship? What's the similarity?
Well, circumcision was the sign of the breach of the covenant.
Yeah.
Between God and goes all the way back to...
Circumcision is the sign of the covenant between God and Abraham. Who cares?
Well, because we talked about it going down through history. So here again, we're going back to a sign of the covenant between God and the Jewish people and making sure that it's a sign that's there in this history, this part of it.
I think the idea that there's a sign of the covenant is very important, but we need to go even further. Because it's a particular kind of sign. Any other ideas?
Does it have anything to do with going back to having your own calendar, being separate people, separate laws, and being children?
So does it have to do with being... I don't think it has to do with having a separate calendar of people, because remember, the stranger is allowed to be circumcised and then offer the Passover offering. The stranger could keep a different calendar. But there's something in that in that act of circumcision that relates very closely, that's your hints, very closely to Pesach.
Against the blood.
Thank you. Marilyn said it's blood. It's not the only thing that connects the two, but I would say it's the most important. Both the redemption from Egypt and the circumcision ceremony have blood as the central themes. People think circumcision is about foreskin. It's not. The Moel says, Va'omar la b'damayich chayi. Go to any bris. The Moel will say that. B'damayich chayi. I say to you, you shall live by this blood. Sound familiar? There's only one story in the Bible where someone or a group of people lives because of blood, and it's Pesach. There are a few other connections, too, that I want to mention. The Bible, several times, talks about excision, karet, leaving the community. This relates, Marlene, to what you said. Central acts of belonging to the Jewish people, and if you don't do them, you're out. But there are only 2 positive commandments in the whole Torah. Positive commandments means thou shalt. There are only 2 positive commandments in the Torah, the violation of which causes you to be excised. We already learned one of them, and it's Korban Pesach. If you don't offer Korban Pesach, you're out. We already read that. There's only one other positive commandment in the Torah that says, where it says, if you don't do it, you're out. And that is circumcision. There are a few negative commandments, right? There are different negative commandments, the violation of which cuts you out of the people. But positive commandments, there's only 2. So there's blood. There is excision. There's the idea Marlene mentioned of peoplehood. Central acts of Jewish peoplehood and circumcision going back to the covenant with Abraham. And here in our story, it's the Exodus from Egypt. And there's one more big connection between the bris and Pesach. What's the other big connection? I'll give you 5 seconds. Anyone know online? Can send me an email that you had guessed it. Eliyahu Hanavi. How many ceremonies are there in Judaism where Eliyahu Hanavi shows up? There's only 2. We sing that song on Haggadah, it's true. But that's not a life cycle, I think that's more of a custom. But the association of Elijah the prophet with the bris. Remember, the baby is put on Elijah's chair, it's in the chapel. Elijah's chair, the circumcision, who is the one who watches over the brit, is also the one that we pray for on Pesach, to watch over us. The connection between redemption, belonging, peoplehood. So the Brit, people say, where does it come from? It comes from Abraham. That's only part of the story. That's only part of the story. I would argue that more of the Brit comes from Yetziat Mitzrayim than comes from Abraham and Isaac. Right? And the proof is that we're being introduced to this, and it's become central to inclusion for offering the Passover sacrifice. No bris, no goat. There is one big difference, however, between the bris ceremony and the Exodus from Egypt that I think, or the Pesach, that I think is really important to note as well. While these are both acts of affirmation of peoplehood, did I prove that point sufficiently to you last week? That offering the Pesach sacrifice is an affirmation of peoplehood in the Bible. If you don't do it, it's like you're not part of the Jewish people. Did I make that point last week? If not, I'm happy I said it again. It's very important because remember, the original Pesach, God passing over the houses of the Jewish people, it would not have happened unless the people said, we will do something. We're going to take the blood, sprinkle it on our doorposts. If you didn't do it, it didn't matter who your father or your mother was. You could be a direct descendant of Abraham. It didn't matter. There was something you had to do. And that's the idea of Pesach through the generations. It is there as a symbol of what must be done so that God will merit this special relationship with you, this sense of belonging. Now that is also done through the Brit Milah, but they're different. Why? Because the Brit Milah is private and the Passover sacrifice is public. Remember the words Kol Adat Yisrael. We've seen it a few times in this chapter, and we see it again, by the way, in verse, where is it? 47. Kol Adat Yisrael Ya'asu Oto. In the Talmud, they explain what this means. It doesn't just mean you will all do it. The Talmud says this means it must be done in public. The offering of the Passover sacrifice had to be done in front of a minyan, gathered in the temple courtyard. You had to have at least 30 people, some say 30 included women, but 30 people. Why 30? Kol Adat Yisrael. 10, 10, 10. So 30 people had to be present. In other words, the Pesach sacrifice cannot be offered alone, which harkens back to an earlier message of the Torah on this theme, which is it can't be eaten alone either. Has to be eaten in a group because you're required to complete the lamb, to finish eating the lamb. Nobody can do that on their own. So you have to join with the group. So too the sacrifice itself must be done in public. That is very different than the Brit. So while the two ceremonies are both affirmations of Jewish peoplehood, they complement each other in the way that they are different. One says, when a baby is born, one says, first of all, the baby is a passive agent most of the time. But even if a person is circumcised when they are older, it doesn't make a difference. It's still being done to you in a private setting, explaining the relationship between Hashem and me. The Brit Milah is a sign between Hashem and me. But Judaism always believed that that is insufficient. There is another Brit, there's another covenant that must be affirmed. What's the missing piece? Is Judaism just about me and my relationship to God? Of course not. What's the missing piece? Kol Adat Yisrael. Kol Adat Yisrael. You know, this is the famous triangle of Jewish life. Hashem, the individual, and the Jewish people. I can have a wonderful relationship with God, but it will be insufficient if I keep every single mitzvah. You must do so in community, and it was Pesach that served as the holiday where I affirmed that relationship. Once the bris happened, that comes first. First, I have to affirm my relationship with God. And every Pesach, we come together to affirm our relationship to each other. Kol Adat Yisrael. That's why it's done publicly. We have to see that act of belonging. Yes?
Everyone has to do it. You can't do it for me. You can't do it.
I read it the same way too, but I'm just saying the Talmud understood this differently, right? And the act of sacrifice, since it said Kol Adat Yisrael, you know, the rabbis like to interpret what does every word mean. We already learned that everyone has to do it, so why are we repeating this again? So the rabbis say it's to teach us another lesson. That not only must everyone do it, which is sort of the obvious literal read from the text, it is also that everyone has to do it in front of everybody else. What is everybody else? 30 people. What I'm talking about the Passover sacrifice, not the Seder. Right? But remember, even though it's done in your home, it can't be done alone. It's not saying it has to be done in a field where everybody can see, right? These the Passover sacrifice was done at the Beit HaMikdash, was performed at the Beit HaMikdash, a walled area, a bayit. But there was a minimum number of people that had to be there to participate, both at the time of the offering and at the time of the eating. Could not be done alone. Even biblically, you could not, because we learned you must be in a group. You have to finish the lamb by midnight.
The actual offering. Before the temple, they had to, they were all there together anyway.
You're saying in Egypt, in Egypt.
After Egypt, before they built the temple was years built.
Yes?
And so when you have your old initial offering, the offering, and you're supposed to do it out of the celebration of home.
Right.
The thing is, you need to do it with so many people in front of you, makes no sense to me.
Well, I would say what we know, I don't know what happened 3,000 years ago. I don't know how they offered the Passover sacrifice. But what we do know about how it was offered, everything is from the time of the temple. And everything is based on the verses of the Bible and how it was interpreted at that time. Not only did the sacrifice have to be offered in public because that was how they interpreted Kol Adat Yisrael, it also had to be offered in public because some parts of the ritual had to be performed by the priests. The blood, remember it says you can't eat any blood? So the blood had to be, it's like a shoichet, right? You had to have someone who knew what they were doing, like a priest who was a shoichet, sort of. You had to have the priest there to help you draw the blood out. So there's no way you could have done this in your backyard. No way. It had to be done in a public setting. Do I know that it's 30? No. That's what the Talmud says. But it could have been less. But it's clear that this ritual could not have been done like a circumcision, which anyone could have done alone. Abraham does it alone. Right? I know we don't think of how could anyone possibly do that alone. But if you can figure it out, counts. Right? The bris is a mitzvah, the father and the child. Just two people. But there are other ideas involved here that everyone participates. I mean, think about it. The Passover sacrifice has to be offered on one day. The 600,000 people that have to offer their sacrifice on the 14th day of Nisan. The only way that's going to work is if it's a giant, massive gathering, noise and tumult everywhere. So there's something public to this day and this offering and this ritual and the act and the eating, the act of eating, that binds together the Jewish people in a particular covenant of peoplehood. That is an aspect of Pesach that I offer is essential. Essential. You can't understand Pesach unless you understand it as the holiday that binds together our commitments to the Jewish people. Even though it's a holiday that thanks God for X, Y, and Z, it also tells the story of the Jewish people. It also makes sure that in the text we're including everybody around the table. Right? All the passages that make for inclusion. The idea that children are there. Adults are there. The elderly are there. The simple people are there. The rabbis are there. Everybody who's a part of Kol Adat Yisrael is celebrating the holiday together. It is not a holiday for intellectuals. It's a holiday for everybody. Right? And as long as you're there sitting at the table, you are affirming belonging in the Jewish people. which I would offer, is the way it always was meant to be. Right? Especially today when for most people, bris is not even their choice. It just happened to you. But as time moves on, a child is asked, hey, like this is why children are included in the Pesach celebration even before their bar mitzvah. Ki yishalcha bincha, we read it last week. When your child asks you, well, what are we doing? We're taking a child that was already brought into one part of the covenant and slowly bringing them in to the other part of the covenant, to the other aspect of the relationship with God, which is a covenant with the Jewish people. And as they grow up, hopefully, they will feel more and more of that sense of belonging and even of responsibility. So, bris Pesach is introduced. Let's keep going. We ended last week, I think, with verse 49. The first time the word Torah is mentioned in the whole Torah. And I think it's just extraordinary that the context in which it's mentioned is context of equality. The purpose of Torah is uniting everyone under one law. Torah Achat. Let's go now to verse 50. The Israelites did so as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. Verse 51. All the Israelites did so. 51. The very day the Lord freed the Israelites from the land of Egypt, troop by troop. Al Siv Otam. My translation says freed, but the Hebrew is hotzi. Brought them out. Pulled them out of Egypt. It does not say Pharaoh liberated them. It says it was God himself who took the Jewish people out of Egypt, took the Israelites out of Egypt, and it happened be'etzem hayom hazeh. I don't know why here it suddenly switches to the day, like what I thought it all happened at night. But most commentaries say, it was a trip, so the sun rose as they were leaving Egypt, so it all happened at night, but they were let out even the next day. Okay, now let's start verse 13. Chapter 13. We're just going to do a few verses at the beginning of chapter 13 that are very important. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, God speaks to Moses further, saying, Kadesh lichol bechor peterechem b'nei Yisrael v'adam kovem alehi. Lihu, consecrate to me every firstborn, man and beast. The first issue of every womb among the Israelites is mine. Why is this? Does this have anything to do with the section that preceded it? It would seem, yes. Why is God saying the firstborn is mine? Because, who did he just save? Because God just saved the firstborn. Right? There is this idea in Pesach, I talked about how the Bible sees Pesach primarily as an observance to express gratitude. Not liberation, but gratitude for survival. Yes, it's true that maybe that's relating to an experience that happened on one night. But there's a different way of seeing the act of survival as well. Survival can also be seen in a multi-generational way, can't it? Well, if my grandparents didn't survive the Holocaust, I wouldn't be here either. Perhaps the act of gratitude is meant not just to display gratitude for what happened on that night all those years ago, but to say we would not even be here today unless God saved us or our ancestors, right? Then we wouldn't be here, excuse me. I think, in our generation, many of us children, grandchildren of the survivors, we feel that, we understand that. We're almost all survivors in some respects. And I think it's the same way for this generation leaving Egypt. It's God saying, you all survived because of me. So we have to keep the memory of this event alive because you yourself are a product of that liberation. And part of the way that will be observed is that every first male child belongs to God. By the way, it's not just child. It's also the first issue of every womb, man and beast. Ba'adam u'ba'behema. We didn't learn anything about any animals being killed in Egypt. So why do you think the man and beast is included? Any ideas? Well, if you take a look at verse 29, it says, not only were the firstborn in the land of Egypt struck down, but also the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and also the firstborn of the cattle. So even though it wasn't clear at the beginning that the firstborn of the Egyptian cattle were going to be struck down, it happens. With the plague of the firstborn, we're picturing mostly, the children of the Egyptians, but it's not true. The cattle also were struck down. That's sort of a surprise. And so it follows later that also the firstborn of the sheep and your herds are also of special status. Kadeshli. Sanctify them. Sanctify means separate them out. Make them holy. Make them different. Verse 3. Moses said to the people, Zachor. There's that word again. The commandment is remember. Et hayom hazeh, this day, on which you went free from Egypt, the house of bondage, and how the Lord freed you with a mighty hand. No leavened bread shall be eaten. I also would circle the word lo ye'achel chametz. Because God freed you, chametz cannot be eaten. There's no explanation here, but we already talked about some different explanations as to why unleavened bread might have been preferred on Passover, might be commanded on Passover. But can I just make one observation here that I think is sort of jumping in your face? The two words of that verse, Zachor, that I circled in my copy. Zachor and Lo Ye'achel Chametz. Those are the two concepts being introduced in this verse, right? Not introduced, but being insisted upon on this verse. Memory and chametz. If you remember what I submitted a few weeks ago about what chametz is, what is chametz? Chametz is that which makes things go wrong. Chametz is leaven. Leavened bread goes bad. What's matzah? Matzah has no leaven in it. It stays, it endures. So to me, it's like jumping out at us from that verse. Why is it that we're being told to remember and then being told not to eat chametz? What's the connection? To me, the connection is obvious. Chametz represents forgetting. And since the commandment of Passover is memory, I don't want forgetfulness in my midst. I only want matzah, which lasts, which endures, which stays. Do you buy it? I don't know. This is my view on this, and I think it's obvious. But I'm just one person. It's the same verse, for crying out loud. Zachor and chametz, like they don't belong unless you make that connection. Hayom atem yotzim b'chodesh ha'aviv. You go free on this day in the month of Aviv. Aviv is another name for for Nisan, and it also means what in Hebrew? Springtime. So this is the verse that is responsible for the 13th month of the Jewish year every couple of years. Since it says you got to go free in the springtime, the calendar must be adjusted so that Pesach is always observed in the spring. Just a reminder, we talked about what spring represents. Spring represents renewal. It represents hope, life. It represents leaving your house, going outside. I mean, Pesach is so connected to springtime, it just wouldn't work any other time of year. Verse number 5. So, when the Lord has brought you out into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall observe in this month the following practice. This is what you're going to do when you get to the land of Israel. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the 7th day there shall be a festival to the Lord. There's that matzah holiday again in chapter 13 being ordained. Verse number 8. One of the most important verses that we're going to review today is that verse. Because of the first word. What's the first word? Vehigadata. What does that sound like? Lehagid. Like, doesn't that sound like a book? Haggadah. There you go. So, where does the word Haggadah come from? Chapter 13, verse 8. Vehigadita. There is a telling. Remember, slowly the Torah is introducing to us the idea that Passover is not just about sacrificing something and eating some things. It's also about telling a story. You will tell Bincha, your child, on that day, Lemor, Ba'avur Zeh. Where do you know that from the Haggadah? Ba'avur Zeh. There's a section of the Haggadah where it says Ba'avur Zeh. What does Zeh mean? This. What is this? Ba'avur Zeh. Exactly. It's a section of Haggadah that says Ba'avur Zeh. When you say this, you have to point to the matzah and the maror on the table. This is the verse. So not only do you need to tell the story, it must be done with props. The story must come to life using symbols around the table. Then you got to tell your child on that day because of this. The Bible probably didn't mean to do so with props, but this is how the rabbinic mind understood this passage. Ba'avur zeh means this thing and that thing and the salt water and the egg and the charoset and the maror and the matzah. Everything there is to tell a story. The story is told over the symbols, the props. And that's why there's different parts of the Seder where we, open the cover and close the cover. Right? Where we hold up the cup of wine, where we put down the cup of wine. If you follow the Haggadah, you'll see it says, lift it up, put it down. Open the matzah, close the matzah. Break here, don't break there. All kinds of actions that are meant to fulfill ba'avur zeh. We tell the story over the symbols. And then this important word. Asa Hashem li. God did it for me. What would you have expected that verse to say? Not that God did this for me, but God did it for our ancestors. I mean, we're already talking now about the Pesach that is going to be observed in Israel. We're years and years and years away from the original event. And yet, this verse, which is probably the verse of the Seder, emphasizes that the Passover story is not history, but must be told as if it is happening to us today. Bechol dor vador chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim is a central principle in Maimonides when he talks about the laws of Passover, and it makes its way into our Haggadah as well. In every generation, one must regard herself as if she herself went out of Egypt. Where does it say that in the Torah? Nowhere. But it does say, Ba'avur ze asa Adonai li b'tzeiti miMitzrayim. God redeemed me when I went out from Egypt. Remember I talked about survival. We're all survivors. One could say that that's the reason why. Another reason could be, well, redemption isn't yet complete. Liberation isn't yet complete. It has to be relived every year. There are pharaohs to which we are enslaved still today. We have to talk about it, understand them. The forces of Egypt, the forces of Pharaoh that still inhabit this world, and remember to liberate ourselves from those as well, not just to think about this as a holiday commemorating a historical event that doesn't really have to do with our lives. Not just a retelling, but a reenactment. Not just a reenactment of what happened to our forefathers, but an enactment of what happened to us. Ba'avur zeh asa Adonai li b'tzeiti miMitzrayim. Verse number 9. This shall serve as a sign upon your hand, as a reminder on your forehead. What are we talking about here?
Tefillin.
Thank you. Now, if I was going to ask you, where did tefillin come from? Where does the Torah mention tefillin? Most people will point to where. Where is the commandment that says to wear tefillin? Most people will say, the Shema, correct. In the Shema, they shall be as a sign, as frontlets between thine eyes and, I don't know the exact Hebrew translation. And they shall be for frontlets between thine eyes and upon thy heart and upon thy hand. Don't quote me. But you know what I'm talking about. Open up any Siddur, look at the Shema, that's where it's commanded. I think very few people remember that that's not the original place where tefillin are commanded. It's not from the Shema. It's commanded right here. This is the verse where tefillin is first commanded. Kadesh li kol bechor. Sanctify to me every firstborn. It's not only the place where it's originally commanded, it's also the first passage in the tefillin. So when you open up a tefillin, it's not just a box. There's 4 compartments, and each compartment has different verses from the Torah, and the first one is Exodus 13. Kadesh li kol bechor. Passover is Judaism. We talked about bris. We talked about even Pidyon Haben. We're about to get to Pidyon Haben. We talked about the calendar, the whole calendar. And here's another central object of Jewish observant life today, the tefillin, and it also comes from Pesach. Now, what does my hand and my head have to do with Pesach? We talked about the relationship between the bris and Pesach. So what is the relationship between hand and, think of it, that verse. This shall serve as a sign on your hand or on your forehead, in order that the teaching of the Lord may be in your mouth. With a mighty hand the Lord freed you from Egypt. It's sort of implied clear in the verse. What's tefillin about? Why do we wear tefillin? Thank you. Right. Because with a mighty hand, God freed you from Egypt. Beyad chazaka hotziacha Hashem mimitzrayim. The tefillin is upon our hand, which is really interesting because we talk often about the tefillin being on our heads and on our hearts, but we forget that actually it's our arm and our hand that are meant to be emphasized in tefillin to remind us that just as you sweep something up quickly with your hand, so did God sweep up his people quickly from the land of Egypt. That is what we are remembering when we put on the tefillin. Some Jews did not understand this verse this way. They said this verse is metaphorical. It's not tefillin, it's just, they should be imaginary signs on your body.
I look at it this way, on the head, because the head is where we remember before.
Yes.
The hand is what we do things with, things that are commanded.
That's excellent, right? What good is your memory? I love that. What good is your memory, that's your head, if you don't do anything with that memory? The whole idea of Pesach is we effect our memory by using our hands to tell a story and to clean our houses of leaven. It's all these actions. I love that. Beautiful. Head tefillin and hand tefillin. But the original justification for tefillin has to do with Yetziat Mitzrayim. Verse number 10. Vishamarta. Remember Leil Shimurim, the night of promises? Well, what is in chapter 13 being ordained by God? You shall keep. Vishamarta. I kept my promise, you keep yours. Et hachukah hazot lemo'ada. You have to keep it in its season, right? There again is the emphasis on the calendar, the repetitiveness of it, the annual cycle. Miyamim yamim, from year to year, from days to days. And when the Lord your God, I'm on verse 11, has brought you into the land of the Canaanites as he swore to you and your fathers and has given it to you. Pesach is not just about where we left, it's also about where we were headed. This verse is the connection to Israel. God didn't just bring you out of Egypt to redeem you from something. He brought you out of Egypt to bring you to somewhere, to a land that he swore to you, lecha. There's again, God saved me from Egypt, and God promised me that there would be a land that he would take me to. It's just extraordinary the way the Bible subtly but clearly You can't really say that subtly but clearly. That doesn't make any sense. I don't know which one I choose. Subtly, but clearly if you figure it out. You know what I mean? Like it's subtle unless you really notice it. It's subtle, but the emphasis on it happened to you. You have to do it. God brought you to this land. Is extraordinary because it takes a story that's historical and makes it relevant miyamin yamima, year to year. You are reenacting the Exodus, which is not just leaving somewhere, but being brought somewhere. L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. The promise was not just made to your ancestors, it's yours. Verse 12. You shall set apart the Lord's every first ishulum, every first male firstling that your cattle drop shall be the Lord. But every firstling ass you shall redeem with a sheep. If you do not redeem it, you must break its neck, and you must redeem every firstborn male among your children. What is that ceremony? What does that sound like? Tifdeh. Pidyon haben. We've almost got every event in the Jewish life cycle here. Tefillin is bar mitzvah. We already mentioned bris. Now we're mentioning pidyon haben. Right? And remember, many of these are rituals that are being done with children. They're included. Speaking of children, verse 14. And there will come a time when your child will ask you, Ma zot. What is this? By the way, do you know which child is it that asked this question in the Haggadah? Sort of obvious. So just a two-word question. What child would ask the two-word question? The simple child. The Tam. Tam ma'hu omer ma zot. What does the simple child ask? What is this? So this verse is connected to the question of the simple child. He asks, what is this? And what do you respond to him? Bechozek yad hotzianu Hashem mitzrayim mibeit avoti. God freed us from Egypt. There again is that mighty hand. A symbol, not to be taken literally, but a symbol for swiftness and strength. We're almost at the end, yay. We're just going to do two more verses. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord slew every firstborn in the land of Egypt, the firstborn of both man and beast. Therefore I sacrificed to the Lord every first male issue of the womb, but redeemed every male firstborn among my children. I just want to say something very, very, I don't want to say that my own comment is interesting, but it is. What's going on here? The firstborn of the animals, they belong to God. You can't redeem them, right? It doesn't say anything about redeeming them. But who do you redeem? Who has to be redeemed? The children. So, chapter 13 is very interesting because it starts out saying, listen, I saved all the firstborn children and animals, so all the firstborn children and animals are mine. But just a few verses later, it says, but you can have the children back. You can redeem them. Not just you can redeem them, you must redeem them. What do you think is going on?
I think it's a prohibition against child sacrifice.
Is it a prohibition against child sacrifice? I don't think it's child sacrifice. There's no, just because it says you're mine, it doesn't mean they're sacrificed on the altar. But it's a different word. It's a prohibition against child what? Well, here's what I would offer. to say to somebody that because you were born in a particular order of birth, your life was now eternally bound by different rules and obligations and restrictions. It doesn't get more Egyptian than that. The punishment against the firstborn you might see as a revolt against caste-based systems. Now, I know you're going to say, but what about a Kohen and a Levi? But remember, the Kohen and the Levites they're not in the story yet. They get that, and a Kohen and Levi is seen as a reward that they get because they didn't worship at the golden calf. So it's a fair criticism that maybe later in the story Judaism says, okay, but Kohen and Levi we are going to give special privileges to. But at this point in the story, the idea that a firstborn child should really become enslaved in some way, that's why I say it's not child sacrifice, but it's a form of child abuse to say you can never get out of this trap that you're in. One shouldn't take it for granted that God gives permission here to say, it could be a commandment the way it's read, but it's at least permission to redeem the firstborn child. You can't do that with an animal. The firstborn animal belongs to God, but the child can free himself. And that, I think, you might want to read as revenge or an answer to the caste-based systems of Egypt, which did give different rights and different privileges based on what family you were from, what order of birth you were in. Yes?
What the distinction between the firstborn son and if it was a daughter, there's no redemption, there's no recognition.
Why so there is the question is the whole question of gender in this whole section. It's not just this verse. There are many other verses that raise questions about were the girls also slayed in the firstborn? We know that with Pharaoh, right? Pharaoh, it says in the Bible, said very clearly, throw the male Jewish children in the river, but save the girls. But it's not clear, right? If I go back to the verse that talks about who died in the plague of the firstborn, it just says, Kol Bechor Be'eretz Mitzrayim. Every firstborn in the land of Egypt. So the rabbis debate whether girls were killed also in the plague of the firstborn. It's not resolved. This verse could suggest that only the firstborn males were killed in the slaying of the firstborn. Or it could also be an answer to Pharaoh's original decree to throw the male children into the Nile. Why only because only the male firstborn is tied, it seems, with that special status as being permanently servants of God. Right? Kol Peterechem Li. The child, your firstborn child belongs to me, belongs to God. I'm pretty sure that there's unanimity that is only the male children. That could be either because only the male children were were killed at the plague of the firstborn, but as I said, it could also be because Pharaoh threw the male children into the river. And if we see this liberating those who might be tied to certain obligations because they're the firstborn, if we see that as liberating that from the caste system of Egypt, it actually would make sense that it's not about the plague of the firstborn, but about Pharaoh's throwing the male firstborn into the river. Because Pharaoh was the one who made distinctions. Women here, men there. And we say equality. We want everybody redeemed. You can do it with the sheep and the animals, right? We can talk about why that's the case. Why didn't God go further and say, liberate all the animals? Why can't you redeem all of them? But at least let's understand that the Torah here saying Pidyon Haben is an option for you on your children might not just be about your choice, but about a message that is being sent with regards to how the Egyptians divvied up the world according to those that were higher on the ladder of importance and those lower on the ladder of importance. And the last verse, "V'hayala'ot al yadecha u'letotafot beininecha ki bechozek yad hotzianu Hashem mimitzrayim." This last verse, which again is about the tefillin, all of this shall be as a sign on your hand and on your heart. And by the way, that verse is part of the second box. There's 4 boxes in the tefillin. So the first one is the first 10 verses of chapter 13. The second box is the next 10 verses of chapter 13. Pidyon haben, redeeming of the child, is also about Exodus from Egypt, the Exodus from Egypt. Right? So the first box is there to say it's about the way God freed you with a mighty hand. The second box might be there to say, and God rejected the way the Egyptians ran the world. Pidyon haben is about God not laying claim on anybody's life, either for the purpose of child sacrifice, but there's many ways we sacrifice our children, not just on an altar for worship. And that's it. We're finished. At least with the biblical sources. And next week, bring your Haggadot. Are there any questions about what we learned today? Any last questions or observations? I'm reading the same Torah that you have on your, and just playing with some ideas. This really is just playing straight from the pshat. The pshat is the simple meaning of the words. What do we think is going on? There's a lot that's unclear. The best we can do is guess. But I think even if all we have are the ordinances that the text makes explicit, that the text makes clear, we still have a lot. Think of all of the different ideas that we talked about, how dense. All we read was a chapter and an additional 16 verses. You know how many chapters there are in the whole Torah? There's a few hundred. All we read is just one and a few other verses. And what have we covered? The entire calendar. The holiday of Pesach. The holiday of Matzahs. The offering of the Passover sacrifice. The centrality of children and the importance of educating them. Brit Milah, Pidyon Haben, Tefillin. Am I missing anything? I'm sure I'm missing things. The equality, one Torah for everyone. The whole idea of Torah, the word Torah. So to me, it's like, if somebody asks me, I only have time to read one chapter in the Torah to understand Judaism. Tell me in 1 foot. Say, read chapter 13. Read chapter 12 of Exodus. You'll get a good understanding.
To fill in there, I understand what you're saying with like about the losing off Egypt, the thing that they put on the fill-in kind of.
No. So it's a good question. Where did it get filled from in Egypt? But remember, chapter 13 begins with, when I take you into the land that I give you, this is how you're going to observe Pesach. So they only, this law would only apply once they entered the land. But still, you probably are tefilling, come on, how did they know to wrap it 7 times around their arm and get the leather straps and dye them? And, well, of course, tefilling evolved. But I'm just telling you where the origin is of our current practice. It's not in the Shema. It's all about the Exodus from Egypt. It's not about having the Torah on us. That happens later. Originally, in its earliest rendition, it is about reminding ourselves that it was God's strong arm that brought us out of Egypt. That's what tefillin are there to help us remember.
So why aren't tefillin used to commemorate Pesach during Pesach?
Interesting. Where are tefillin at Pesach?
Well, and then why are they worn more than just on Pesach?
Why wear them more? Well, the text does not say when to wear them and when not to wear them. It just says wear them.
It's not part of the Pesach commemoration.
It is being spoken of as a Pesach commemoration, but it just says you will wear these to remember what God did to you. It doesn't say just wear them that night. And it doesn't say only during the day. It doesn't say only at night. There's no question that the laws of tefillin are much more complicated and evolved from here to become our current practice. And it's very possible to read this and say, maybe that only applies on one night. It doesn't apply every day. But that's just not how Judaism developed, right? In the course of time. But it's clear, with the emphasis on Zachor, over and over and over again, that many of these remembrances are not supposed to be just for one night a year. And in fact, we remember the Exodus twice a day, at least, every day. When we say the Shema, Ani Hashem Elokechem asher hotzeiti etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim le'olam Elohim. In the Shema, you say at least twice a day, God brought us out from Egypt. So it is being remembered. But the rabbis understood Ba'avur zeh asa Adonai li be'eretz Mitzrayim. Remember that verse at the end of chapter 12? Ba'avur zeh, because of this. So the famous commentary on those words is, when the Pesach and the Maror are munachim lefanav, when they are out before you. In other words, the memory, the story must be told that night. You can thank God and remember the Exodus every day. But v'higadet lebincha, you will tell your child on that day. What day? The day when the matzah and the maror is being born. There's a day that is of crucial importance, but there's no question that there's also a memory of the Exodus from Egypt that is day to day, that endures from day to day. Yes?
On Passover, we don't worship
We don't, but you could. Wear tefillin on Passover. You could. Now, why do we not? Because we don't wear tefillin except in the morning today, and also we don't wear tefillin on Shabbat or Yom Tov at all. But the Bible, like these verses, don't say anything about that. So, like I said, tefillin gets regulated and develops in its own way. But you're absolutely correct that if you read this verse, you might think, hey, there's something special about tefillin on the night of Pesach. But in fact, tefillin are so special that the rabbi said, no, it's every day. You have to remember this every day. All right. Haggadah next week. Thanks, everyone.